Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Wendigo stories. Number 1. My wife and I have been running the rat race for years, with a family, a house in the city, 2 dogs, a cat, the stereotypical American dream. But the city took its toll, the neighborhood got worse, the crime rose, and we found ourselves looking for a way out. Our opportunity came when I was offered a new job out of state. It was a great career move, but we didn't want to move to a new city just to have the same problems again. So we started looking around and found a great mountain community about an hour and a half from the job, and a great ranch-style house with a big back porch, windows everywhere, and a lot of property. The backyard has a big grassy area and a creek that cut the property in half, then acres of woods beyond. It was huge. The house was more than twice the size of our house in the city, all updated, and had no neighbors within a mile. It was a radical change from the life we lived in the city, but best of all, it was less than half of what we were paying for our old house. The house was a foreclosure, and when we asked the listing agent about it, she simply said the old family had abandoned the property. We really didn't think anything of it. The first 3 months were uneventful, with us settling into our new life, the kids getting used to the new school and new friends, and most of all, us getting used to the big house and the property. But then the weather turned cold and things started to get weird on the property. It started with noises from the back, things we chalked up to being in the woods. Then the motion lights around the house started going off randomly. Once again, we just chalked it up to being in the woods. But last night, it all changed. Last night was the most terrifying night of my life. One of the dogs was at the back door whining and scratching. I assumed he needed to go to the bathroom, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked out the back door. Instantly, something felt off. The dog bolted for the back property, growling and snarling. It was a cold night, about 30 degrees, but the dog plunged straight into the creek and out the other bank, running off into the woods in the back of the property. Flashlight bouncing, I ran after him, calling his name. I got to the creek and made my way across the makeshift bridge, trying desperately to follow him. I could hear the dog still growling and barking from somewhere up ahead, and I pushed further away from the safety of the house and deeper into the woods. That's when I heard it. A shriek like I've never heard before in my life. It was a mix of a moaning wail and metal on metal. It echoed through the trees and froze me in my tracks. My dog bounded its way back to me and cowered down behind me. I turned around and could just make out the warm glow of the house behind me and the cold dark ahead of me. I swung my flashlight around, wildly looking for the source of the noise. That's when I heard an even more terrifying noise. Out of the cold silence, my wife's voice floated all around me. "Babe," the voice called out. I whipped back around and could just barely make out the image of my wife safely inside her house. The voice called out again. "Babe, I'm right here," came the voice from deeper in the woods. Then came another voice, just as clear as the other. It was my dad's voice. "Come out here," it called. I swung the flashlight round again, and this time caught the briefest glint of light bouncing off of eyes. The creature was in my beam of light for barely a second, but it was tall, maybe 6 feet, and ashen white. It had long, spindly fingers that grasped the trunks of a pine tree, and then it was gone. I turned back and ran towards the house. I ran headlong into the icy creek and stumbled. My dog ran past me, making its back to the yard and up the porch. I dug my hands into the freezing muddy bank and pulled myself out, not stopping to look back. When I reached the porch, I scrambled inside. My wife ran over to me asking what had happened. I just shook my head. I'm not certain myself what happened. I had a growing sense of dread tonight as the sun began to fall. We kept the dogs inside, and I haven't dared to look out the back. But as I sit here, just thinking, one by one, my motion lights in the backyard keep going on. Story number 2. When I was 8 years old, both of my parents worked full-time. My dad was predominantly on third shift at his job, and my mom was an elementary school teacher. We lived literally right up the road from my grandparents in a very small town. It was getting close to my 9th birthday when I contracted strep throat and scarlet fever. I was severely sick, could barely speak, had the first case of cold sweats that I remember in my life, and I could barely pull myself out of bed to even use the restroom. I was absolutely miserable, and of course, being as young as I was, I didn't take the pain very well. My poor mother was at a loss of what to do, with her working and my dad needing to use daylight hours to sleep. The first day I was sick, perhaps it was a Tuesday, my birthday would fall on a Friday. My dad stayed up most of the day with me, made me food, let me sleep in his lap on the couch, wiped my forehead down, made sure I took my medicine, etc. But on the second day, my grandmother had called and offered to let me stay at her house so my dad could sleep. He said yes and woke me up around 7 that morning to drive me up to her home. My grandfather also worked at this time too, so he was already gone to work when I arrived there. I don't remember too much of the early morning. I probably just slept in my grandmother's bed, tossing and turning when I'd wake up feeling extra bad. She encouraged me to swallow my awful tasting medicine a little more gently than my dad did. She did fix me some tomato soup to try and eat, and it was the first time since I'd gotten sick that I had an appetite. I should mention my grandmother had this cute Yorkshire Terrier named Samson. He was very docile, not like the usual annoying barking all the time terriers. Samson came into the room and curled up next to me as I dozed. I do know when I woke up at some point, it had to be early afternoon around lunchtime, because I could hear the TV faintly from the living room on some game show. My grandmother had a ritual of eating her lunch while watching a game show. I think it was The Price is Right. I was trying to fall back asleep because I had gotten this really bad headache, maybe from dehydration. I was on the verge of sleep when I was jolted awake by the Samson yelp that erupted from the living room. The terrier curled up next to my feet, perked up, but didn't move. I knew I had heard his name being called too, but it was odd he didn't respond. "Samson," my grandmother called again. "Samson! Samson!" The dog still didn't run out of the room to her. I was confused, as he was so obedient to my grandmother. He was almost frozen, staring at the cracked open door, but making no attempt to go to her. She called Samson 3 or 4 more times. Then I got annoyed. I remember flinging the covers off of me. Of course, my clothes are sticky with sweat, and I just generally felt uncomfortable and groggy. I stumbled out of the room, wiping my eyes, asking, "Grandma, do you need Samson? He's in your room with me." I was in the living room, and I did a double take. The TV was still on and blaring. There was a bowl of soup sitting on the coffee table and an open Pepsi next to it, but my grandmother isn't anywhere in the room. Maybe she was in the bathroom? I crossed the room and went past the kitchen. That was empty too. I got to the bathroom door, which was shut, and knocked. Nothing. I then opened it. No one was in there. The house was empty. It's not a huge house either. I covered all of the rooms. So yes, my first reaction was to get scared. I could clearly hear my grandmother calling for the dog, but she was not anywhere inside. I felt my hands and my feet get all tingly. I started shouting for my grandma, but my voice just echoed through the small, cramped home. Samson had gotten up at this point and was sitting near the couch looking completely undisturbed. I fumbled for the remote and turned the TV off and yelled, more like wheezed, to the top of my lungs, which you can imagine how painful this was with a scratchy, infected throat. "Grandma!" The worst part happened next. I heard her shouting my name back, clear as ever, like she was standing only a feet away. I started crying now, scared out of my mind. I felt like maybe it had to be a ghost. I grew up with scary ghost stories courtesy of my dad, and I was convinced I was now in the room with a ghost. And then she, whatever this was, proceeded to call my name again. Then there was a second voice, definitely not my grandmother's. It was deeper, definitely more masculine, and absolutely terrifying as it shouted, "Come to the front door." I did not do that. Instead, I made sure to run back to my grandparents' bedroom, lock the door, and pick up the telephone on their nightstand. I called my own home phone, and my dad's sleepy voice answered. Through a barely comprehensible voice, I managed to croak something like, "Daddy, there's someone in the house and I can't find Grandma. She's gone." My dad, of course, jumped out of bed, grabbed his Swiss Army knife he kept in a drawer next to the bed, and ran down the road to the house in his PJs and bare feet. He ran up to the front door, jiggled the handle. It was locked. So he made his way around, and since he knew the garage code, just punched it in and got inside. A quick sweep of the 3 rooms in the home showed no one was in there. It wasn't like there was really anywhere to hide. I ran out of the room once I was sure he was there and began bawling in his arms. He kept reassuring me there was no one here and then asked if I did know where Grandma was at. I said I hadn't and explained I had woken up to her calling for Samson, but she hadn't been anywhere there. This was back when cell phones were definitely around. But there was no iPhones, and my grandparents certainly wouldn't have been buying them anyway. My dad had one, but not on him at the time. I could tell he was trying to keep calm, so he just said we would need to go back to our house. I was sure he was probably going to call the police at that point, just because my grandma still hadn't popped up, and her car had been in the garage when he got there. If she'd left, she'd gone on foot. We hadn't even made 2 steps out of the driveway when from my grandma's neighbor's house, my grandma was strolling out chatting to the neighbor. She saw my dad and then me, prying my eyes out, immediately ran over to see what was wrong. She was super apologetic. She said she'd stepped out right when she'd heated up her soup to see her neighbor, who called about looking at something my grandma was going to buy. My grandma had figured I was asleep, and she'd only be gone for 10 or 15 minutes. At first, people might have assumed I was feverish, therefore delusional, but I still stand by what happened. I know for a fact I was definitely alone in the house, save for Samson, but the voices I heard were real. For a while, I was hesitant to go back to my grandma's house, because this happened in the middle of the day. I later read stories at a school about Wendigos, or creatures that could disguise their voices to lure people. This was the closest explanation I could ever form about what I heard. I never shared it with anyone that I thought it was for sure Wendigo, and just chalked it up maybe to being a ghost. I'm close to my 20s now. Last year was the first time I shared this story fully with my grandpa, who used to say the fever must have made me have bad dreams. We were sitting on the front porch of the house smoking cigarettes and exchanging anecdotes. When I finished telling him for the first time, he looked sort of disturbed about it. He finally put his cigarette out and just stared out into the road. Then he cleared his throat and looked over at me. "You know," he said slowly, "some funny things used to happen around that time. The middle of the night, I'd wake up to take a piss or something. When I'd first sit up in the bed, I could hear your grandma sleeping away, snoring." He chuckled, but his face grew serious again. "Anyways, I'd always hear her calling for the dog." I had to remain looking calm, but my voice still shook when I asked him, "Even when she was sleeping? Sleep-talking?" "No," he shook his head. "I heard her calling from outside. Maybe the living room? I don't know, honey. She'd call for the dog. She'd call my name. All while she was really sleeping next to me, sleeping like a baby." "Have you ever told anyone?" "No. I don't want to scare her. She's really scared of ideas like ghosts and stuff. That's why, when you were younger and that thing happened, I told her to remember you'd been sick, fever and all, probably having a nightmare." He looked gravely at me. "Don't repeat this to her, please. She's really not the type to be scaring." Of course, I wanted to cry. I had this itchy, creepy feeling suddenly about being at the house. "Grandpa, do you still hear it sometimes?" "Oh, yes." He was now reaching into his breast pocket to get out another cigarette. "Every night. But you just gotta remember not to do what it says. Even the dog figured it out. If it says to come to the door, you stay away from the door. If it says, I don't know, come here, you just stay in the room where you're at until it quits calling." With that, he asked to borrow my lighter again. Story number 3. I grew up in the northern part of Wisconsin on a Native American reservation. As a Native American kid, you grow up learning a lot about the mythology of our people, many mythical creatures and spirits, but I was always pretty skeptical, especially when it came to the monsters like Bigfoot. But all that changed one day. It was mid-December, and it was freezing out. Had to be around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. My friend David and I were at his family's house for dinner. After the dinner was finished, his grandmother asked us if we would go to her cabin and chop some logs. She was going out there with her husband, and he was out hunting, and she wanted to be nice and warm. Of course, we told her we would. What else could we do? So we threw on our jackets and boots and headed out. It wasn't too far, less than a mile, and we went straight into the woods instead of walking the road. So that's what we did. Trekking through snow that is at times thigh-high isn't fun in the best of situations, but, as I said, it was like just 10 degrees. When we finally arrived, we went inside and started a fire with a few remaining split logs and warmed up a bit. The crackling flames were peaceful, but David kept pacing and looking around uneasily. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me he felt like he was being watched. I told him that it was ridiculous, that we should start chopping wood before it got dark. So we got the axe and went outside and began to chop. We were doing that for about an hour when we first heard it, very faintly. It sounded like a girl screaming. We thought it must have been the wind, so we went back to the logs. A few more minutes went by and we heard it again. This time there was no mistaking it. A girl was yelling for help. Then the wolf howled. We looked at each other and ran in the direction of the scream. We got to a spot where all the snow was packed down, and there were paw prints all around. We began to yell for her, tried to get her to answer. That is when I heard the noise that haunts my dreams. The only way it can be described is an angry, hateful shriek, and it was close. David started running before me, but I caught up pretty quick. I was mentally kicking myself for leaving the axe back at the cabin, but that is where we were heading. Once we got back, we would be fine. At least, that's what I told myself. It didn't quite work out that way. Before we got into the cabin, David fell. I turned to help him up, but he wasn't there. Just a long drag mark. I yelled for him, but got no response. I started moving in the direction of the mark when I got hit. I didn't see what hit me, but I sure felt it. I was knocked off my feet and my chest felt like it was on fire. I glanced down and saw my jacket was shredded, and blood was everywhere. I couldn't breathe. I felt myself about to pass out, and I saw it. It was tall, had to be about 9 feet, covered in thick, dirty white fur, a mouthful of fangs, but no lips, clawed hands covered in blood, and its sunken eyes were pale yellow. I didn't know what it was, but it no longer mattered. I was losing blood quickly. How could I survive this? When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My chest was bandaged, and there was a police officer by my bed. When he saw that I was awake, he asked me what happened. I told him everything. He told me they found David's jacket and boots in the woods, but there was no sign of him. The doctor told me I was attacked by a bear and that I had hallucinated from blood loss. Eventually, I recovered enough to be released. As far as I know, they never found David, and I haven't gone in the woods since that day. Story number 4. Growing up in Arizona, you experience a rich mix of cultures. People come here from the Midwest. Some people brave the desert and come from the South, and some people have been here since before this place was a state. Some say this is because Arizona has no real culture of its own, and we borrow from everywhere else. This state is rich in the paranormal. Many Native American tales tell of demons, skinwalkers, vampires, tribes of little people who take children in the night, Wendigos up north, or the always popular Thunderbird. This isn't a story about all that. This is the retelling of my experience with the Lady in Black. Growing up, I would hear stories from my friends who are of Mexican background of La Llorona, the Lady in Black. The story is meant to keep children inside after dark and to keep them from sneaking out at night. These legends of the lady came north of the people. It seems, though, that she came along too. The story goes something like this. There was a beautiful lady in old Mexico. She was not from a rich family. Nevertheless, she caught the attention of the son of a Mexican nobleman. They fell in love in secret. They got married. Not long after that, she became pregnant with twins. Like all ghost stories, this one ends tragically. The nobleman's son was found out. The father was so enraged that his bloodline was tainted with the blood of a commoner that he tried to force the local bishop to grant a divorce, to dissolve the marriage. Mexico was very Catholic in those days. The bishop refused. The father eventually seemed to cave in, and he allowed her to move into the house. She eventually gave birth to twins, one boy, one girl. A year later, the son of the nobleman was called off to war. He didn't return. The father became reclusive, hardly talking or eating. He grew to hate the children that would now inherit everything. The commoner, marrying into his family, waiting for him to die to take everything. He ordered his men to take the children to the nearest river and drown them, and let their bodies be taken by the current at night so there would be no proof. The children were taken in the middle of the night without a sound. The mother was kicked out of the house the next day and later accused of killing her children. The townsfolk eventually drowned the broken-hearted woman. She didn't put up a fight. She had already died inside. Days later, the nobleman and his men were found dead in this house. Sightings started happening of a beautiful woman, dressed in black, roaming the streets at night, crying, looking for her children. If you saw her and you were a child, she would stop crying, grab you, and take you to the river where you would be drowned. I told you that story to tell you this one. I was out running about a month ago, as I often do. I run late at night, around 10 or so. I run near the canals that are all over Phoenix. I take my American Bulldog with me so that no one messes with me. The path I take when I go running is very well lit and is right next to canals and houses. It always felt safe until the night I saw her. I was running with my dog as usual. I was listening to my iPod and tracking my mileage. I started to see something in the distance about a quarter mile away. It looked like a person under one of the street lamps that lighted the path at night. I thought nothing of it at first because I often see people when I run. As I got closer, I began to notice that this person wasn't moving, just a silhouette under the light. The closer I got, the more the silhouette started to take shape. When I was about 50 feet away, I just stopped. My first thought was that it was a homeless person, or this was some sort of prank. My dog started to whimper, then growl, then whimper, then growl again. I had never seen him do that before. I looked at her. I could tell it was a woman. Something about her deeply unsettled me. Then I got the feeling in my stomach that something wasn't quite right and that I needed to get out of there. I couldn't see her face. Her hair was long and black. It was a covering. She looked like she was wearing a short black dress, which was odd because it was 60 degrees at night. She was tall, taller than I had first estimated. She was thin, and her arms and legs seemed to be a tad too long for her body. She was just standing under the street light. I took my headphones out because I was going to ask if she was all right. Before I could ask, my ears were filled with this very fast Spanish being spoken in a whisper. It was raspy. The voice filled my head. She raised one long arm at me and extended her index finger. It looked more like a long tree root than a finger. I'd had enough. My dog sensed my fear. I took a step back. She took a step forward. I paused for what seemed like a solid minute, but it was probably a few seconds. That's when I started to hear the crying. It started off as a wail, then grew into a full scream. I turned tail and ran as fast as I could to the main road. When I looked back, she was gone. I ran back to my neighborhood along the main road. The entire time I was trying to make sense of what had just happened and whether or not someone was fucking with me. The entire run home, I could feel eyes on me. I entered my neighborhood. The feeling was still there. I was dreading running back to my house because there are areas that aren't well lit. I decided to sprint the last quarter mile. As I was doing this, I happened to look down a cul-de-sac that had one light at the end. Yes, she was there, her silhouette as clear as day. She had not only followed me and kept pace with me, but she had also beaten me to my neighborhood. My dog pulled. We made it to my front door. I opened it and ran inside and slammed it. I took a shower and tried to forget about everything. I locked every door in the house and the door to my bedroom. My dog slept at the foot of my bed that night, and I left the TV on. I drifted to sleep around 3 a.m. The next morning, I woke up and discovered that somehow I'd acquired a large scratch that ran down the whole of my bicep. It would eventually scar. A few days after that, I was talking with my neighbor, as I often do. I told him about what happened. He said this: "I know what that was. The best advice I can give you is to leave her alone. She marked you and will leave you alone. She marks the ones she doesn't like and takes the ones she does." He told me something similar had happened to the person who lived down the street from us. It ended up driving him crazy. He said that it all started with a picture his niece drew him. He wouldn't say any more than that. He kept telling me to leave it be. I called my friend Justin after that. I couldn't let this go. How could I? I'd been followed by something and was marked. This kind of thing doesn't just happen to people. My buddy Justin's family is Mexican. He also loves this sort of thing. I described what happened and asked if it was La Llorona, the lady from the story. He told me that it was possible, as there were many vengeful spirits like this. He told me the same story I wrote out above, except with a few key distinctions. The lady was never pregnant, but she was beautiful. She fell in love with a nobleman's son, who played with her heart, promising to marry her, but instead married another woman. The woman, broken-hearted, became depressed, and she began to see her beauty as a curse. She took a knife and disfigured her face. He told me that no one who saw her face from then on, because she would cover it with her long black hair. When he told me this, I thought back to my encounter, and my blood turned to ice. The legend finished that she longed for someone to love her for her heart and not her beauty. This didn't happen, and she eventually drowned herself. She was cursed, though, and now wanders looking for someone who will love her. She will never be satisfied. Her hatred has twisted her. Some people see her as a monster. To some, she appears as a beautiful woman. Those she appears to as a beautiful woman will be driven mad with affection for her. Those are the ones she's chosen to love her. Those are the ones who can see her for herself and don't see her as a monster. I got off lucky, I guess. This should have been the end of it. This should be where the story ends. It doesn't. I became so curious, I went to my neighbor who lives down the street. I had to know what became of the other man who saw her. When I knocked, an old woman answered. I told her that this would sound weird, but that I needed her help. I asked her about the man who used to live here. Turned out it was her ex-husband. I cautiously asked her if she knew anything about a woman in black. She looked at me in a funny way and asked me if I had seen her. I told her I had. She gave me the same advice my neighbor had given me, to leave it alone. I told her this was no longer an option. She sighed and told me to come with her. We went into her attic and she gave me 2 large boxes. She said that everything I wanted to know was in there. This was apparently all that her ex-husband had left in his apartment when he disappeared. She told me to read everything, and that if I still wanted to look for her after that, then I was a fool. I took the boxes home and spent a weekend going through everything. There were journals, home movies, drawings, and other things I'm still not sure about. The thing that unnerved me the most was a drawing that looked like it had been done by a child. It was all black, of a tall, thin figure with long hair, long arms and fingers that looked like roots. My stomach turned uneasily. I matched the drawing to one of the first journal entries. September 17. I can't shake the feeling that I am being followed. I went on a walk again last night to see if I could find her. It seems she has found me. Macy, who I found out was his niece, drew me a picture today. She had been staying with us while my brother and his wife are in Denver. She handed me the picture and told me that the lady who lives under the stairs told her to draw it and to tell me she wasn't coming back. I have to see her again. This crazy guy seemed to be in love with this woman. He was obsessed with her. I will include a few more entries. Most of the journals are bogus. He kept them and seemed to document to show that he wasn't going crazy. Most of it seems to be babbling on about trying to find her. October 5th. I'm no longer in love with my wife. Llorona, as I have come to call her, has my heart. I saw her face. She showed me her face. She's beautiful. I have to be with her. I understand her. She is not a monster. She's a beautiful woman. October 7th. She visited me in my dream last night. I never wanted to wake up. She spoke to me in a voice sweeter than honey. I have decided to leave my wife. He did. December 13th. The new apartment isn't grand or glorious, but it's ours. She comes to me at night, telling me that we will soon be together. I'm going to start recording our encounters to show everyone I am not crazy. This is love. This is pure. I am happy and she loves me. This is where things get really weird. He started taping himself with a video camera. I watched most of it. He kept the lights mostly off. He said she likes the darkness better. He only had 1 or 2 lights on at a time. From the looks of his new home, he was living in a cheap apartment. One video in particular was set up in a bathroom. He had grown a beard by this point. In his video, he took out a razor and instead of shaving with it, he removed the blade and started cutting his face with it. He took blood from his face and drew a heart on the mirror. He looked over his shoulder into the darkness and said, "I love you too." Then the whispering started. The camera cut off. The last tape was the weirdest by far. It starts off with him sitting down at his dining table, which was a fold-down card table. He had a large smile on his face. That's all the tape showed for 3 minutes, is him sitting and smiling in the dark. His eyes seemed to follow something around the room. He nodded occasionally. The light above the table eventually went out, at which point the camera turned to night vision. He was still smiling. Then a shadow appeared behind him. Long root-like fingers found their way down his chest until her palm found its place on his shoulder. He closed his eyes and his smile widened. The last part of this video made my head hurt and my stomach lurch. "Mi amor," I heard the voice say on the video before the camera shut off. They never found his body. That night, I packed his stuff up the next morning, returned his things to his ex-wife. I have stopped looking for her. I wonder if she ever thinks about me.